Sometimes, to truly understand the beginning of a story, we must look back to what was left behind. And to understand how the Second World War took root, we have to return to the end of the Great War, the one that was meant to be the last. By 1919, the world lay in ruins. Millions of lives had been lost, empires had crumbled, and civilization itself seemed to have looked into the abyss. The victors, France, Great Britain, and the United States, gathered at Versailles to shape the peace that would follow. But what emerged from those negotiations was not a lasting peace. It was punishment, and from that punishment, resentment began to grow. Quietly at first, like a seed buried deep in wounded soil, the Treaty of Versailles, signed by a German delegation forced to accept it without question, was a humiliation unlike any other. Its terms were harsh, unforgiving. Germany was declared solely responsible for starting the war. This was not just a moral statement, it was a legal foundation, a justification for every other sanction that followed. The German territory was carved apart. The nation lost its colonies in Africa and Asia, and even parts of its own European land. Coal and mineral-rich regions like the Saar were placed under international control, and any union with Austria was strictly forbidden. What little remained of national pride was stripped away. But perhaps the most unbearable wound was financial. The Allies demanded reparations so vast they defied belief. More than $500 billion in today's value. Economists like John Maynard Keynes, who took part in the negotiations, warned that such conditions would drown Germany's economy and destabilise the entire continent. But his warnings were ignored, and so a nation already scarred by defeat was plunged into economic chaos. Hyperinflation spiralled out of control. People carried wheelbarrows full of banknotes just to buy bread. Overnight, the value of money vanished, and with it, the savings of an entire middle class. Poverty spread, confidence crumbled, and in the ruins of that despair, the Weimar Republic, Germany's fragile new democracy, was seen by many as weak, corrupt, and nothing more than a puppet of the victors. Humiliation, resentment, despair, the perfect soil for the most dangerous ideas to grow. People desperately searched for a figure, a movement, someone who promised to restore lost honour and avenge the injustices of Versailles. The stage was ready for leaders who knew how to prey on fear and stoke hatred. The ghost of the Great War had not been buried. It lingered, whispering promises of revenge into the minds of a people who only wanted to believe in themselves again. Before you settle down completely, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from all over the world. This is the Sleepy History, and my aim is for this story to immerse you in a quiet experience while you find restful sleep. Humiliation and economic collapse did not take long to sow seeds of resentment and a yearning for revenge in the heart of Germany. The German people felt betrayed not only by the world, but by their own leaders. They believed the promises of peace from US President Woodrow Wilson, built on the idea of self-determination, had been ignored and replaced by a vengeful treaty. The guilt of the war was driven like a thorn into the national pride. That wound became perfect breeding ground for extremist movements. They promised to restore the nation's glory and undo the injustices of Versailles. Moderate political parties faltered, unable to offer swift solutions to misery and chaos. In this vacuum of power and hope, radically nationalist figures and movements gained strength, among them the National Socialist Party, which knew how to channel people's frustration. Meanwhile, on the international stage, the peace that had been achieved was fragile. The League of Nations, created to prevent future conflicts, proved inefficient and apathetic. Though its purpose was noble, it lacked military force and the authority to enforce its decisions. It functioned more as a forum for debate than as a true international arbiter. The victorious nations, exhausted by war, showed great international apathy. Great Britain turned its attention to its vast empire. France worried about its own security, building what it believed to be an impenetrable defence, the Maginot Line. The United States, with its isolationist doctrine, refused to join the League of Nations, immediately stripping the organisation of moral authority. This vacuum of power and the absence of a strong international voice allowed the aggressions of totalitarian regimes to grow with little meaningful opposition. The dictators quickly understood that inaction and the fear of democratic powers were their greatest allies. Peace was only an illusion, held in place by inertia, and soon the winds of war would blow again over Europe and the world. With the table set by German resentment and international fragility, the stage was prepared for the rise of a man who knew how to exploit those passions and fears. Adolf Hitler did not ascend by force, but through politics, taking advantage of the weaknesses of the Weimar Republic. His National Socialist Workers' Party, the Nazis, began as a small fringe movement, yet it grew rapidly with a message that was both clear and dangerously seductive. He blamed the Weimar Republic for Germany's misery. He accused the communists, and above all, the Jews, portraying them as the root of defeat in the Great War and the architects of economic collapse. His words, woven with promises to restore lost greatness, resonated deeply among a desperate people longing for a strong leader. In 1933, amid political chaos, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Once in power, he wasted no time consolidating control. Within a single year, the opposition was crushed. The fire that consumed the Reichstag, the German parliament, became his pretext to suspend civil liberties and persecute communists. Soon after, the Enabling Act granted him dictatorial authority, allowing him to rule without parliamentary consent. The dismantling of democracy was swift and merciless. Unions, political parties, and any voice of dissent were outlawed. The Gestapo, his secret police, ensured silence through fear. With power secured, Hitler turned toward fulfilling his promise, the rebirth of German pride. He openly defied the Treaty of Versailles and began the secret rearmament of the nation. While the League of Nations and Western powers looked away, the German army grew. Factories for weapons multiplied, and new aircraft were built. He violated naval restrictions, reoccupied the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone, and no one intervened. Each act was a test not just of his boldness, but of the world's hesitation. And with each unchecked move, Germany grew stronger, while the rest of the world convinced itself that Hitler posed no real threat. Adolf Hitler was born in 1889 in a small Austrian town, a man of humble beginnings who would one day alter the course of history. His early life was marked by conflict. A strict, overbearing father who wanted him to follow a civil servant's path, and a gentle, devoted mother whose death from cancer in 1907 left a scar that would never fade. Unlike his father, young Adolf dreamed of art of painting grand landscapes and living from beauty rather than discipline. But those dreams shattered when he was twice rejected by the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. After his mother's death, he moved to Vienna, surviving in poverty, selling postcards painted by his own hand. It was there, in the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a city alive with culture, diversity, and tension, that his toxic worldview began to take shape. He absorbed the feverish mix of German nationalism, anti-Semitism, and racial hatred that circulated through Vienna at the time. For him, these ideas became a refuge, a bitter comfort for his own failures. And when the Great War erupted in 1914, it was, for Hitler, a release, a chance to belong, to fight for a purpose greater than himself. He enlisted in the German army as a volunteer, not the Austrian one. Driven by a deep sense of nationalism for the land he considered his true homeland, he served as a messenger on the Western Front, a task as perilous as it was vital, and was wounded twice. For his courage, he was awarded the Iron Cross, First Class, an honour he cherished above all others. For Hitler, the war was more than a battle, it was a revelation. In the brotherhood of the trenches, he felt for the first time that he belonged to something greater than himself. But the defeat of Germany struck him like a personal catastrophe. While recovering from a mustard gas attack in a military hospital, he could not comprehend how an army he believed invincible had fallen. The explanation he embraced, fiercely and without question, was the stab-in-the-back myth. He convinced himself that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield, but betrayed by the politicians of the Weimar Republic, the socialists, and above all, the Jews, whom he accused of poisoning the nation from within. After the war, Hitler joined a small and almost unknown political group in Munich, the German Workers' Party. It was a handful of men meeting in the back rooms of beer halls, but soon his fiery speeches and uncanny ability to tap into people's frustrations lifted him to prominence. Those smoky taverns became his training ground, places where he refined his message, weaving resentment into rhetoric, blaming Germany's problems on Versailles, communism, and the Jews. His words, drenched in anger and false promise, drew in disillusioned veterans, jobless workers, and a middle class crushed by hyperinflation. In 1923, he attempted a failed coup, the beer hall putsch, that ended in his arrest and imprisonment. Yet this failure would mark a turning point. In his cell, he began writing Mein Kampf, My Struggle, a manifesto outlining his vision for Germany, his worldview, and the ideology that would soon plunge the world into darkness. When he was released, Hitler understood something crucial. Power could not be taken by force. It had to be seized through legality, through the cracks and weaknesses of democracy itself. Then came the Great Depression of 1929. The German economy collapsed, millions lost their jobs, and despair spread across the nation. The Nazi Party, with its simple slogans and radical promises, began to grow rapidly. Election after election, their influence expanded, until the once insignificant party became the largest in the German parliament. On January 30th, 1933, amid political chaos, conservative German leaders, believing they could control him, persuaded President Paul von Hindenburg to appoint Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. They thought they could use him to stabilize the nation. They were catastrophically mistaken. They had underestimated the fanaticism, the discipline, and the cold ambition of a man who had waited his entire life for that moment. At the moment he swore the oath of office, Adolf Hitler, the failed artist, the war veteran, the restless agitator, ceased to be a man shouting in beer halls and became the ruler of a nation. A man with power, and with that power the chance to bring his darkest dreams to life. Now, let's slow down for a moment, because while Hitler was rising in Germany, another man, equally ambitious, equally dangerous, was shaping his destiny in Italy. Benito Mussolini was born in 1883, his father a blacksmith and socialist, his mother a Catholic schoolteacher. Two worlds clashed in him, rebellion and discipline, ideology and faith. From a young age, Mussolini was drawn to politics. He became a fierce socialist, the editor of the party's newspaper, sharp-tongued, fiery, and unafraid to provoke. He preached class struggle and condemned nationalism and militarism. But when the Great War broke out, something in him shifted. Mussolini turned his back on socialism, a movement that opposed war, and instead called for Italy to join it. That decision cost him his place in the party, but gave birth to something new. After the war, Italy was in chaos. The country had been promised new territories, but those promises were broken. The economy lay in ruins. Strikes, protests, hunger and anger filled the streets. And Mussolini saw his moment. In 1919 he founded the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento, the Italian combat groups, a movement that rejected both socialism and liberalism. Their message was intoxicating: nationalism, strength, and the dream of restoring Italy's lost greatness. His followers, dressed in black shirts, carried not only flags, but clubs. They attacked political opponents, silenced critics, and spread fear. Then, in 1922, came the March on Rome. It wasn't a massive battle, it was a spectacle of intimidation. But the king, Victor Emmanuel III, instead of resisting, handed Mussolini power. And just like that, Italy's democracy died quietly. Mussolini became Il Duce, the leader. He banned all other parties, silenced the press, and built a totalitarian state around his image. Propaganda turned him into a myth, a man chosen to resurrect the Roman Empire itself. For Mussolini, that wasn't just a symbol, it was his mission. He launched agricultural campaigns like the Battle for Wheat, pushed massive industrial projects, and filled Italy with the illusion of progress. But beneath that illusion, his hunger for empire grew, and in 1935 he made his move. Italian troops invaded Ethiopia, a member of the League of Nations, using tanks, aircraft, and mustard gas. It was a brutal campaign, one that would reveal to the world what fascism truly looked like when it came wearing medals and banners. Ethiopia fell quickly. Its soldiers, armed with rifles from another century, faced tanks, planes, and clouds of mustard gas. They never had a chance. The League of Nations, that fragile promise meant to preserve peace after the Great War, condemned the invasion. But words, once again, were not enough. The sanctions were weak, symbolic. Mussolini took Ethiopia, and the world watched. That silence spoke louder than any protest. It showed leaders like Adolf Hitler that no one, not Britain, not France, not anyone, was willing to risk another war to stop aggression. The lesson was clear: the world would rather look away. And so, the axis between Rome and Berlin began to take shape. The gears of a new global conflict had started to turn. But far from Europe, another power was rising, silent, disciplined, and guided by a code older than any ideology. Japan. Its most feared figure was General Hideki Tojo, born in 1884 from a samurai family. His father, an army general, taught him loyalty, obedience, and honor. Tojo lived by those words and turned them into something cold and absolute. He wasn't like Hitler or Mussolini. He didn't shout in squares or charm crowds. He was a soldier, precise and ruthless. They called him Kamisori Tojo, the Razor. In Japan, during the 1930s, the army had taken control from the politicians. The generals believed their island, poor in natural resources, had to expand or die. And Tojo was their perfect man. By 1940, he was Minister of War. A year later, he became Prime Minister, and Japan ceased to be a constitutional monarchy. It became a military machine. The new ideology was simple and dangerous: Asia for the Asians. But what it really meant was Asia for Japan. They said they would liberate the continent from Western powers. But liberation came with bayonets and burning cities. The first proof of that came years earlier, in 1931, with the invasion of Manchuria in northeast China. The army staged an explosion on a railway line, blamed it on Chinese troops, and used it as a pretext to attack. It was the perfect lie, and it worked. Manchuria was rich in coal, iron, and land, everything Japan needed. The invasion was a blatant violation of international law. The League of Nations condemned it, again with words, and Japan's answer was simple. It walked out of the League entirely. Once more the world did nothing. And the lessons spread from Tokyo to Berlin, from Rome to the future battlefields of Europe. Aggression, it seemed, had no consequence. The fall of Manchuria became the first echo of what was coming, because that small war in Asia was not a regional conflict, it was the first shadow of the global fire that would soon consume the world. The road to war had no turning back. The 1930s were a slow march toward catastrophe, and the world watched it happen. While totalitarian powers advanced with confidence, the democracies of the West, Great Britain and France, responded with caution, hesitation, and above all, fear. That fear took the shape of a policy. It was called appeasement. The belief that by giving dictators what they wanted, peace could be preserved. It sounded reasonable. After all, Europe was still haunted by the ghosts of the Great War. Millions of graves, cities in ruins, families broken. No one wanted to relive that nightmare. And the Great Depression had left nations exhausted, poor, and unwilling to fight again. Many in the West even believed Hitler might have a point. They said the Treaty of Versailles had punished Germany too harshly, and if all he wanted was to reunite the German-speaking peoples, maybe, just maybe, giving in would prevent another conflict. At the centre of that illusion stood Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister. Polite, cautious, and always carrying his umbrella. He believed in diplomacy, in reason, and in the idea that peace could be signed on paper. In 1938, he had his chance to prove it. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia populated by ethnic Germans. Instead of defending Czechoslovakia, their ally, Britain and France, chose to negotiate. The result was the Munich Pact. Chamberlain, France's Édouard Daladier, Mussolini, and Hitler gathered in Munich to decide the fate of a nation that wasn't even invited to the table. They handed over the Sudetenland to Germany without a single Czechoslovak voice in the room. When Chamberlain returned to London, he waved the agreement and proudly declared, "Peace for our time." The crowd cheered. Europe sighed in relief. But peace, that fragile, paper-thin dream, lasted less than a year. In March 1939, Hitler broke the pact and invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. There were no excuses left. His ambitions had nothing to do with protecting Germans. They were about domination. Appeasement had failed. It hadn't stopped the dictators. It had fed them. Each concession had been a green light, each silence an invitation to go further. And as the illusion of peace collapsed, one voice, isolated, stubborn, and prophetic, rose above the rest. That voice belonged to Winston Churchill. Born in 1874, heir to a noble family and a restless spirit, Churchill had lived through war, politics, and failure. He had warned his country again and again. The danger was real, and the time for illusions was over. Soon the world would learn he was right, because by the time they listened, it was already too late. Winston Churchill was many things: soldier, writer, politician, and at times a man completely out of step with his own era. His political career had been long and turbulent. He switched parties more than once, earned powerful enemies, and never hesitated to speak his mind. Yet even his harshest critics admitted one truth: his words had weight. In the 1930s, while the majority of Britain's political class embraced appeasement, Churchill stood alone, a stubborn voice of warning in a hall full of silence. He had seen too much to believe in easy peace. From the dusty fields of South Africa during the Boer War to the blood-soaked trenches of the First World War, he understood what unchecked power could unleash. And so, speech after speech, he denounced Hitler's rise. He warned that Germany's rearmament, the reoccupation of the Rhineland, the annexation of Austria, and the betrayal of Czechoslovakia were not isolated acts, but calculated moves in a deliberate march toward war. His words often fell on deaf ears. The newspapers mocked him, his colleagues dismissed him as a relic of the past. But history, patient and merciless, would prove him right. After the Munich Pact, Churchill looked at Neville Chamberlain, the man who had traded land for promises, and said one of the most chilling phrases in modern history. "You were given the choice between war and dishonour. You chose dishonour, and you will have war." It was not just a rebuke, it was prophecy. When Germany finally invaded Poland in September 1939, the illusion of peace vanished. The war Churchill had warned about for years had begun, and when Chamberlain resigned under the weight of defeat, it was Churchill, the very man once called an alarmist, who was summoned to lead Britain through its darkest hour. He took office in May 1940, just as France was collapsing and the Nazi shadow stretched across Europe. His unbreakable spirit, his voice defiant and resolute, became a lighthouse for a nation surrounded by darkness. But before that great chapter began, another shadow was cast, one far more cynical and unexpected. Because the spark that would ignite the Second World War was not only Germany's aggression, but a shocking alliance between two mortal enemies. On August 23, 1939, the German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop flew to Moscow to meet his Soviet counterpart Vyacheslav Molotov. That night, under the watchful eye of Joseph Stalin, they signed a pact that stunned the world, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. To the public, it was a simple declaration of non-aggression between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. But hidden within its secret clauses was something far darker, a plan to divide Europe. The world could hardly believe it. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, two sworn enemies, had just shaken hands over the corpse of Europe. For years, Hitler's speeches had dripped with hatred for Bolshevism. His entire ideology revolved around destroying communism and conquering the East. And for Stalin, fascism was the embodiment of everything he despised. Yet now, the two men had signed a pact, not of friendship, but of convenience. Behind the public promise of non-aggression hid a far darker secret. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, as it became known, included a secret protocol, a plan to carve up Eastern Europe like a map drawn in pencil and blood. Germany would take Western Poland and Lithuania. The Soviet Union would claim the East, along with Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Bessarabia, territories that now belong to Moldova and Ukraine. For Hitler, this alliance was strategic genius. It guaranteed that Germany would not have to fight a war on two fronts, the same mistake that had doomed them in the First World War. With the Soviet Union neutralized, he could now turn his armies westward and invade Poland without fear of interference. For Joseph Stalin, the pact was a grim necessity. He knew the Red Army was still weak, scarred by his own purges, and unprepared for a full-scale war. This agreement bought him precious time, time to rebuild, rearm, and reclaim territories once lost by the Russian Empire. Both men, however, understood one thing perfectly. This peace was temporary. Sooner or later, they would face each other. But for now, Europe would pay the price. The signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact on August 23, 1939, was the final nail in the coffin of peace. With Stalin's hands tied and no obstacle left in the east, Hitler gave the order that would change the world forever. At dawn on September 1st, 1939, without a declaration of war, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. At 4:45 a.m., the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte. Moments later, tanks rolled across the border, dive bombers screamed through the skies, and the modern age of warfare was born. This was not the slow, grinding war of trenches that Europe had known 2 decades earlier. This was Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, a terrifying new strategy based on speed, shock, and coordination. Tanks, the feared panzers, broke through the front lines like steel thunder. Behind them, motorized infantry swept in to crush resistance. Above them, the Luftwaffe rained destruction from the sky, acting as flying artillery. The Polish army fought bravely, but they were facing something the world had never seen before. In just weeks, Poland would fall, and with it, the fragile illusion that Europe could avoid another catastrophe. The true horror, however, came from above. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies without opposition. In the first days of the invasion, the infamous Stuka dive bombers, with their piercing sirens that screamed death, tore apart Poland's defences. Roads, bridges and railways were obliterated, cutting off reinforcements and isolating entire divisions. Polish pilots fought bravely, but their air force was small and outdated. Many still flew planes from the early 1930s, while the German aircraft were faster, deadlier, and far more advanced. On the ground, the contrast was even more brutal. The Polish cavalry, symbols of national pride, charged heroically. But against panzers and machine guns, bravery was no longer enough. And behind the speed and efficiency of the German invasion lurked something far darker: ideology. The Nazi vision of racial superiority turned the war into an instrument of terror. Civilians were massacred, villages were burned, prisoners of war were executed. For Hitler, this wasn't just conquest, it was cleansing. By mid-September, Poland's fate was sealed. And then came the final betrayal. On September 17th, 1939, as Polish forces desperately tried to resist the Germans in the west, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, fulfilling its part of the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Caught between 2 totalitarian powers, Poland was devoured from both sides. In just a few weeks, the nation ceased to exist. Europe had witnessed its first taste of a new kind of warfare, one defined by speed, brutality, and total destruction. The old world order, shaped by diplomacy and treaties, had collapsed overnight. Meanwhile, in London and Paris, the West faced a terrible truth. They had promised to defend Poland, and now Poland was gone. Still, honour demanded action. On September 3rd, 1939, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain spoke to his nation over the radio. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany. France followed hours later. The Second World War had officially begun. Yet, astonishingly, the guns in the West remained silent. While Poland was crushed, the armies of France and Britain stood waiting behind their fortifications, unwilling to strike. The French hid behind their mighty Maginot Line, a wall of steel and concrete thought to be impenetrable. The British Expeditionary Force joined them, expecting a long wait. But the war they had declared seemed unreal. The following months became known, with bitter irony, as the Phony War, or in German, the Sitzkrieg, the Sitting War. There were no major battles, no offensives, only patrols, minor skirmishes, and leaflets dropped from planes instead of bombs. Europe waited, holding its breath, but the silence was deceiving. Behind that uneasy calm, Hitler was already preparing his next move, a strike that would shatter the illusion of safety and unleash chaos upon the continent. They also believed that, as in the Great War, the harsh winter and the mud would halt the German advance in the east. However, this assumption turned out to be a disastrous mistake. Hitler and his generals used that period of apparent calm to rebuild their forces, plan their next offensive, and consolidate their control over the conquered territories in the east. The so-called War of Joke became a gift for Hitler. It revealed to him that the Western powers were still trapped in the outdated mindset of the previous war. They failed to grasp the true nature of the Blitzkrieg and thought they still had time to prepare. But time was precisely what they lacked. The silence on the Western Front was not the peace they wished for, but the quiet before the storm that was about to engulf Europe. Though the French and British armies remained passive on the front lines, the war was far from over. On the contrary, the Wehrmacht was already preparing its next move, and it would not unfold in Central Europe, but far to the north, across the icy lands of Scandinavia. Hitler's next objective was both strategic and vital for his war machine, the invasion of Norway and Denmark. This operation, launched on April 9th, 1940, and known as Operation Weserübung, was not an act of impulse but a calculated manoeuvre. Behind it lay a crucial factor, the control of Sweden's iron supply routes. Sweden, though officially neutral, was the main provider of iron ore to Germany. Most of this ore was transported by rail to northern Swedish ports and then shipped along the Norwegian coast to Germany. During winter, when the Baltic ports froze, this maritime corridor became indispensable for sustaining Germany's arms production. If the Allies succeeded in seizing the Norwegian port of Narvik or mining those sea routes, they could effectively strangle Germany's supply of raw materials, crippling its capacity to produce tanks, aircraft, and munitions. The invasion of Denmark was swift and almost effortless. The small nation lacked the military strength to resist. German troops crossed the border, air raids struck a few strategic sites, and faced with overwhelming force, the Danish monarchy surrendered almost immediately to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Denmark remained under German occupation but was permitted to retain a limited degree of autonomy. The conquest was swift, clean, and strategically decisive. Norway, however, proved to be an entirely different challenge. The invasion combined naval and aerial assaults of remarkable coordination and daring. German forces landed simultaneously in multiple key ports along Norway's rugged coastline. Their mission was not merely to seize the cities, but to secure crucial ports and airfields for continued operations. Meanwhile, German paratroopers, an innovative force at the time, captured vital airfields to ensure the rapid arrival of reinforcements. The Norwegian resistance, though courageous, was ultimately insufficient. The army, poorly equipped and outmatched, could not halt the German advance. Alarmed by the invasion and the growing German control over the North Sea, the British and French decided to intervene, sending troops to assist the Norwegians. This marked the first true land confrontation between Axis and Allied forces. The fighting in Norway was fierce, especially in the Narvik region, where the Allies briefly managed to recapture the port. Nevertheless, the initial victories could not be sustained. Hitler had proven his willingness to risk everything in pursuit of strategic goals. The Luftwaffe's absolute air superiority made the arrival of reinforcements nearly impossible. Meanwhile, Britain faced an even greater crisis unfolding in France. The failure in Norway became the final straw for Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who was forced to resign. His place was taken by the indomitable Winston Churchill, a lifelong opponent of appeasement, who would now lead Britain through its darkest chapter. The invasion of Norway not only secured Germany's vital iron supply, but also reshaped the political landscape of Great Britain, bringing to power the man destined to stand against the Nazi storm. The deceptive calm of the phony war was now gone for good. While the democratic nations were still focused on the Norwegian campaign, Hitler prepared his next masterstroke, the offensive that would bring France to its knees in record time. On May 10th, 1940, the Wehrmacht launched a massive onslaught that would not stop until France surrendered. The French, supported by the British Expeditionary Force, expected a repetition of World War I. Their entire strategy rested on defence, with the mighty Maginot Line as its cornerstone, a vast network of bunkers, tunnels, and artillery stretching across the border with Germany. To them, it was an impenetrable shield. But the German command, under the daring vision of generals like Erich von Manstein and Heinz Guderian, conceived a radical new plan. They understood that attacking the Maginot Line head-on would be suicide, so they devised a bold alternative. The idea was to concentrate the bulk of their panzer and infantry divisions in the Ardennes, a region of dense forests and rugged terrain considered impassable for tanks. The French, confident that no serious attack would come from there, had left it weakly defended. The gamble paid off brilliantly. At astonishing speed, the German panzer units burst through the Ardennes, catching the defenders completely off guard. Within days, they had driven deep into Allied territory, severing communication and supply lines of the forces positioned in Belgium. The Blitzkrieg worked exactly as planned. Speed and shock shattered the enemy's resolve. The tanks, commanded by General Guderian, advanced relentlessly, never pausing to consolidate their gains. Their only mission was to advance, spreading chaos and terror wherever they went. By the time the Allies understood what was happening, it was already too late. The German onslaught had broken through with such force that it reached the English Channel, completely encircling the French and British forces trapped in the north. The Maginot Line, once the great hope of France, had become useless. It had been bypassed with ease, leaving its mighty guns and soldiers facing the wrong direction. Its failure was a brutal demonstration of how obsolete static defensive tactics had become in the era of mechanized warfare. With the French army shattered and the north of the country under German control, the road to Paris lay open. The fall of France was inevitable. After the collapse of the front in the Ardennes, the main figures of the campaign in France emerged, those who embodied the triumph of the new German strategy, and those who came to symbolize defeat and collaboration. The face of success in the Battle of France was General Heinz Guderian. Considered one of the key architects of the Blitzkrieg, Guderian was a visionary who understood the true potential of tanks, or panzers, better than any other military leader of his time. While most Western armies still viewed tanks as support vehicles for infantry, Guderian saw them as the primary instrument of attack. He argued that they should be concentrated in large armoured divisions, which, supported by the Luftwaffe, could advance rapidly and deeply into enemy territory, without pausing to secure their rear. During the invasion of France, Guderian put his theory into practice. Ignoring cautious orders from his superiors, he drove his panzers relentlessly through the Ardennes and toward the English Channel, advancing so fast that even his fellow generals considered his pace reckless. His audacity and the speed of his armoured units, combined with the total surprise of the French, split the Allied armies in two and sealed France's fate. On the French side, defeat had a face as well. Marshal Philippe Pétain, once a hero of the First World War and a symbol of national resistance, Pétain in 1940 was an ageing man of 84 who saw the collapse of the French army as a catastrophe beyond salvation. Convinced that the war was lost, and upon being named the head of government, his goal was no longer to resist, but to negotiate a surrender with Germany to avoid the total destruction of France. On June 22, 1940, the armistice between France and Germany was signed. Instead of complete occupation, a collaborationist regime was established in central France, with its capital in the city of Vichy. The Vichy government, presided over by Pétain, nominally controlled the southern half of the country, while the north, including Paris, was placed under direct Nazi occupation. Though it claimed to defend French sovereignty, the Vichy regime became little more than a puppet government, collaborating with the Germans in the persecution of Jews and the repression of the resistance. Marshal Pétain, the celebrated hero of Verdun in the Great War, had gone from being the saviour of France to the head of a regime that betrayed the democratic ideals of his nation. While General Guderian's panzer divisions sliced France in two, a human and military drama of epic proportions unfolded on the shores of the English Channel. On the small beach of Dunkirk, more than 400,000 Allied soldiers, mostly British, found themselves trapped, the sea behind them and the relentless German army closing in. It was a deadly trap, and what followed would go down in history as Operation Dynamo, the legendary evacuation of Dunkirk. If you've made it this far in the video, I hope you're already subscribed to the channel. This is Sleepy History, and my goal is to build a great community of people who, like you and me, love the night and the pursuit of knowledge. Thousands of minds from around the world connected by that inner drive to understand more, to know oneself better, and to live more consciously. I always say it, and I'll say it again, learning history is essential to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. That's why I invite you to take just a few seconds to subscribe and share this video with a friend who's as passionate about knowledge as you are. And if your generous spirit ever moves you to send a super thanks to this humble narrator, know that my gratitude, even just for your presence here, is infinite. Now, let's get back to our story. When Winston Churchill became Prime Minister, the situation was bleak. Yet instead of surrendering, he launched a daring rescue plan. The British Admiralty assembled every available vessel, but it was clear that the Navy alone wouldn't be enough to evacuate so many men in so little time. Then, in a remarkable show of resilience and unity, the British people answered the call. A public appeal went out, and an armada of civilian ships responded. From small pleasure yachts to fishing trawlers, tugboats and lifeboats, hundreds of private vessels crossed the channel to join the rescue effort. These were the little ships of Dunkirk. While the large Royal Navy destroyers couldn't reach the shallow beaches, these small boats shuttled endlessly between the shore and the warships, ferrying soldiers to safety. But the operation was anything but easy. The Luftwaffe attacked relentlessly, bombing the beaches and ships without mercy. Above them, the Royal Air Force fought desperately to shield the men on land and sea. The losses were immense, the conditions chaotic, and yet, against all odds, Operation Dynamo became a miraculous success. Against all odds, in just 10 days, more than 338,000 soldiers were evacuated, saving the very core of the British Army from total annihilation. For many in Britain, Dunkirk was not seen as a defeat, but as a triumph of courage and will. They had lost their weapons, their vehicles, and almost all their equipment. but they had saved their men. And that, in the darkest hour of the war, was a victory of the human spirit. The story of the Dunkirk evacuation is so powerful that it has inspired countless films and documentaries. One of the most acclaimed portrayals is Dunkirk, 2017, directed by Christopher Nolan. Rather than following a traditional war narrative, the film focuses on the human experience of the evacuation through three interwoven perspectives: land, sea, and air. Nolan's storytelling structure is unique. The land sequence, following a young soldier trying to survive on the beach, spans 1 week. The sea story, depicting the crossing of the civilian boats, unfolds in a single day. And the air sequence, following the RAF pilots protecting the evacuation, lasts just 1 hour. This non-linear timeline converges into an emotionally powerful climax. Unlike most war films, Dunkirk uses minimal dialogue. Instead, Nolan relies on visuals, sound design, and music to create tension. The persistent ticking of a clock throughout the film reminds the viewer of the urgency of time, the fragile race between life and death. It's not just a story of heroism, but of fear, exhaustion, and the solidarity that arises when humanity faces the impossible. Nolan's film captures the true essence of the miracle of Dunkirk and introduces it to a new generation as a story not of military triumph, but of endurance and hope. After the fall of France, Great Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. In his most iconic speech, Winston Churchill vowed that Britain would never surrender. The island prepared for the inevitable, a German invasion. But for Hitler, conquering Britain first required destroying the Royal Air Force and gaining control of the skies. Thus began Operation Sea Lion. The Battle of Britain was unlike any before it. Not a clash of tanks or infantry, but the first great air battle in history. It began in the summer of 1940. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, was powerful and battle-hardened. The RAF, on the other hand, was outnumbered, with fewer aircraft and pilots. The German strategy was simple: destroy British airbases, radar stations and aircraft factories to force the nation to its knees. Day after day, the skies above England roared with combat. Waves of German bombers, escorted by fighter planes, attacked relentlessly. But the RAF, flying its now legendary Spitfires and Hurricanes, held firm. Exhausted but unyielding, the British pilots fought back with incredible bravery. And in the end, what tipped the scales was not a plane, but a technological revolution: the radar. Although the Germans had developed their own version, the British radar system was far more advanced. It allowed them to detect incoming waves of German bombers from over 100 kilometers away. With this crucial information, the RAF could direct its limited squadrons of fighters at just the right moment to intercept the enemy, gaining a decisive tactical advantage. Unlike the Germans, who were forced to keep their aircraft constantly airborne, the British could conserve their planes and pilots on the ground until it was time to strike. As the Battle of Britain dragged on, Hitler's frustration grew. In a desperate attempt to crush British morale and force a surrender, the Germans shifted strategy. They stopped targeting airfields and began bombing major cities, especially London. This bombing campaign, known as the Blitz, began on September the 7th, 1940. For 57 consecutive nights, German bombers rained destruction on the capital, levelling homes, factories, and landmarks. Hitler believed that terror would break the will of the British people. Instead, it had the opposite effect. The population, taking shelter in the London Underground and in basements, found unity and defiance amid the ruins. Churchill's speeches, filled with courage and determination, transformed suffering into strength. Morale, far from collapsing, soared. What Hitler failed to realise was that by diverting his attacks away from RAF airfields, he had given Britain the breathing room it desperately needed. The factories and air bases he had once targeted were now spared, allowing the RAF to repair its aircraft, regroup, and return to the fight stronger than before. By the autumn of 1940, unable to destroy Britain's air defences, Hitler was forced to postpone Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The Battle of Britain was not a crushing victory, but it was a turning point, a moral triumph that proved the island would not surrender, no matter how alone it stood. While London endured the bombs of the Luftwaffe, another front of the war raged across the scorching sands of North Africa. This often overlooked campaign was vital for the control of the Suez Canal and the oil fields of the Middle East, both crucial to the war effort. At first, the Desert War was a series of advances and retreats between British and Commonwealth troops and the Italian army, whose numerical advantage could not make up for poor training and outdated equipment. Everything changed in early 1941, when Hitler sent one of his most brilliant commanders, General Erwin Rommel, to Africa. Leading the Afrika Korps, Rommel quickly proved himself a master of mobile warfare. His tactics were based on speed, surprise, and exploiting every weakness in the enemy's defence. Under his command, the German forces, though outnumbered, won a string of stunning victories, driving the British to the edge of Egypt. His daring manoeuvres and use of deception earned him the nickname the Desert Fox. Rommel became a living legend, admired by his soldiers, respected by his enemies, and feared across the desert sands. Unlike many Nazi generals, Erwin Rommel was respected even by his enemies for his sense of honour and chivalry on the battlefield. To stop Rommel's brilliance, the British needed a leader capable of matching his tactical genius. In August 1942, that leader arrived, General Bernard Montgomery. A meticulous and confident strategist, Montgomery was known for his careful planning and his unshakable belief in victory. He promised his men that there would be no more retreats. Inspired by his determination, British troops, who had been pushed to the brink of collapse, regained their fighting spirit. The decisive confrontation between these two legendary commanders came in October 1942, in the Second Battle of El Alamein, a small town in northern Egypt. This time, Montgomery had a clear advantage in manpower and tanks. His plan was not a reckless frontal assault, but a steady, relentless offensive designed to wear Rommel down. The battle turned into a brutal clash of armour across the desert sands. Rommel, with his supply lines stretched thin and his forces exhausted, could not withstand the pressure. The defeat at El Alamein was decisive. Montgomery's victory not only saved Egypt and the Suez Canal, but it also marked the first major Allied triumph on land. As Winston Churchill famously said, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." From that point forward, the Axis powers began to lose their grip on North Africa. The victory at El Alamein marked the beginning of the end for their desert campaign. It was a powerful reminder that war was not only a matter of weapons and numbers, but of willpower, strategy, and leadership. After securing North Africa, Hitler turned his attention to southeastern Europe, the Balkans, a region of immense strategic importance. Before launching his long-planned invasion of the Soviet Union, he needed to ensure control of this area for two main reasons. First, he had to protect the southern flank of his coming offensive. Second, and perhaps most critically, he wanted to prevent the British from establishing air bases in Greece, from which they could bomb the vital Romanian oil fields that fueled Germany's war machine. The Balkan campaign began in April 1941, and was characterized by the same speed and brutality that had defined the Blitzkrieg. The invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece was not effortless, especially Yugoslavia, which resisted fiercely in the first days. But the German war machine was overwhelming. In a matter of days, the Yugoslav Air Force was obliterated. German tanks and infantry advanced rapidly through the countryside, while the Luftwaffe bombarded Belgrade, the capital, without mercy. The Yugoslav government surrendered in less than 2 weeks. The invasion of Greece unfolded in a similar way. Although the Greeks had successfully repelled an earlier Italian invasion, they stood no chance against the might of the German army. Even with the support of a small British expeditionary force, the Greek resistance quickly crumbled under the advance of the German panzers. Within weeks, the Greek army capitulated. British troops, once again, were forced to evacuate a second Dunkirk, this time from the Greek ports. Many of them, however, were captured before they could escape. Germany's victory in the Balkans came at a price. The campaign had cost Hitler something more valuable than men or equipment: time. The invasion of the Soviet Union, initially planned for the spring of 1941, had to be postponed for several weeks to allow the troops to regroup and resupply. At first glance, that delay seemed minor, but in the months to come, it would prove fatal. That lost month meant that the German advance would eventually be caught in the brutal grip of the Russian winter, a season that no army in history had survived unscathed. The Balkan campaign secured Hitler's southern flank, but it robbed him of the summer that might have changed everything. By mid-1941, with nearly all of Europe under his control, Hitler was preparing for his most ambitious and colossal operation yet: the invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. This was no ordinary military plan. It was driven by Nazi ideology, by the belief that Slavs and Jews were subhuman, and that the vast territories of the Soviet Union should become Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people. It was also a direct betrayal of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the non-aggression agreement signed just 2 years earlier. On June 22, 1941, the very same date Napoleon had invaded Russia more than a century before, Hitler launched his attack. It was the largest military invasion in human history. Over 4 million Axis soldiers, 3,500 tanks, and 2,500 aircraft stormed across a 1,600-kilometre front, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. The assault caught Joseph Stalin completely off guard. Despite multiple intelligence warnings, he refused to believe that Hitler would betray him so soon. The plan followed the same Blitzkrieg strategy that had devastated Western Europe, but now applied on an unimaginable scale. The German forces were divided into 3 main army groups, each with a distinct goal. The Army Group North, tasked with capturing Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg, cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution. The Army Group Center, the strongest, aimed directly at Moscow, the heart and brain of the Soviet Union. The Army Group South, ordered to seize Kiev, the fertile lands of Ukraine, and eventually push toward the vital oil fields of the Caucasus. At first, everything seemed to go according to plan. The German offensive advanced with breathtaking speed. The Luftwaffe wiped out thousands of Soviet planes while they were still on the ground. Panzer divisions raced eastward, encircling entire Soviet armies in massive traps. Millions of Red Army soldiers were killed or captured in the opening weeks. Operation Barbarossa had begun, and for a brief moment it looked unstoppable. The German advance was so swift and overwhelming that the Axis leaders became convinced the Soviet Union would collapse before winter arrived. The Red Army, weakened and disorganized after Stalin's brutal purges of the 1930s, retreated in chaos. But beneath this apparent success lay a fatal flaw in Hitler's grand design, a catastrophic underestimation of the Soviet will to resist, and of Russia's most powerful ally, its winter. Hitler and his generals believed the campaign in the east would be quick, over in a matter of months. They were not prepared for a prolonged war. By late autumn, the German advance began to falter. The roads turned into seas of mud, supplies lagged behind, and Soviet resistance grew fiercer with every passing day. Then came the true enemy, General Winter. Temperatures plummeted to -30 and even -40 degrees Celsius. Engines froze solid, fuel became thick like tar, and oil turned into blocks of ice. German tanks refused to start, weapons jammed, and soldiers dressed only in thin summer uniforms froze to death by the thousands. Snow buried the front lines, cutting off supply routes and isolating entire divisions. The mighty Wehrmacht, which had swept through Europe with unstoppable speed, now found itself immobilized, starving, and shivering in the Russian snow. And just as the Germans began to break, the Soviets found their strength in the form of a man named Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov was a master strategist, disciplined, calculating, and unyielding. At the very gates of Moscow, he took command of the city's defense. He rallied every available force, hardened Siberian troops accustomed to the cold, hastily trained militias, and ordinary citizens turned soldiers. Then, in December 1941, at the peak of the brutal winter, Zhukov struck back. His counteroffensive hit the frozen and exhausted German troops with overwhelming force. Equipped for the cold and driven by fierce determination, Soviet divisions pushed the invaders back. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht suffered a crushing defeat. The dream of a quick victory had vanished. Operation Barbarossa had failed. The Soviet Union had not fallen. It had risen, bloodied, but unbroken. The myth of German invincibility was shattered, and the Eastern Front turned into a relentless, grinding war of attrition that would decide the fate of the world. But while the snows of Russia swallowed Hitler's armies, another storm was brewing thousands of kilometers away, across the Pacific Ocean. Throughout 1941, tensions between Japan and the United States had reached their breaking point. Japan's imperial ambitions in Asia had grown increasingly aggressive, and in response the US imposed an oil embargo, a move that threatened to choke Japan's military machine. Backed into a corner, Japan faced a fateful decision: yield to American pressure or strike first. On the quiet morning of December 7th, 1941, Japan made its choice. Without a declaration of war, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Within 2 devastating hours, the Pacific Fleet was left in ruins, battleships burning, aircraft destroyed, and thousands of sailors dead. The world had changed forever. 18 warships were sunk or left unusable, including 8 battleships. More than 2,500 soldiers and sailors lost their lives that morning. The attack wasn't just a tactical victory for Japan. It was a bold strategic move meant to cripple the US Pacific Fleet and buy Japan the time it needed to expand across Southeast Asia without American interference. But there was one crucial mistake. The Japanese didn't target the US aircraft carriers, which happened to be out at sea that day, nor did they destroy the repair docks or fuel reserves. Those overlooked targets would later prove decisive. The mind behind the operation was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of Japan's combined fleet. Unlike many of his peers, Yamamoto knew America well. He had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington. Despite designing the attack, he personally opposed going to war with the United States. Yamamoto understood its industrial might and long-term economic potential. He predicted Japan might dominate the Pacific for 6 months, maybe a year, but after that, the American war machine would take over. He hoped that a devastating blow at Pearl Harbor would scare the United States into staying out of the war. Instead, it had the opposite effect. The surprise attack unified a nation that had been divided between isolationism and intervention. On December 8, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling December the 7th a date which will live in infamy. Congress responded with near unanimous approval for a declaration of war against Japan. Days later, Germany and Italy, Japan's ally, declared war on the United States, convinced that Japan's involvement would weaken the Western powers and force them into peace talks. It was a grave miscalculation. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. What had been a mostly European war now became a truly global conflict. And with the United States, armed with unmatched industry and resources, entering the fight, the course of the war was about to shift forever. By the spring of 1942, Hitler abandoned his dream of capturing Moscow and turned his gaze south toward the oil-rich fields of the Caucasus. Along the way stood a city that would become legendary, Stalingrad. Named after Stalin himself, it was both an industrial hub and a powerful symbol. What began as a seemingly secondary objective would soon turn into the bloodiest battle of the entire war. That summer, the German 6th Army, led by Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, began its advance towards Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe bombed Stalingrad until the city was nothing but rubble, and German troops marched into what became a nightmare of ruins. What was meant to be a swift victory turned into a brutal test of endurance. Stalin had ordered his soldiers not to retreat a single step, and the Soviets defended every street, every building, every floor. The fighting descended into chaos. A savage, close-quarters battle fought in basements, factories and sewers. German tactics designed for open-field warfare were useless here. As winter closed in, General Paulus's 6th Army found itself trapped in the frozen ruins of the city, surrounded and cut off from supplies. In November 1942, the Soviets struck back with Operation Uranus, a massive counter-offensive that encircled the German forces completely. Hitler refused to allow Paulus to retreat, arrogantly promising that the Luftwaffe would keep them supplied from the air. A promise that proved impossible to fulfill. Inside the encirclement, the situation was hellish. Soldiers starved, froze, and succumbed to disease. Ammunition ran out, food disappeared, and morale collapsed. Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, expecting him to commit suicide rather than surrender. But on January 31st, 1943, Paulus surrendered. It was an unprecedented humiliation. For the first time, an entire German army was captured. The Battle of Stalingrad became a decisive turning point in World War II. The German army lost over 800,000 men, and the myth of Nazi invincibility was shattered. From that moment on, the Soviet forces took the initiative, pushing the Germans back and changing the course of the war in the east. While Stalingrad marked the turning point in Europe, another battle would do the same in the Pacific, the Battle of Midway. Unlike previous naval clashes, this one was fought entirely between aircraft carriers, ushering in a new era of naval warfare. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto planned to lure the US fleet into a trap near the Midway Islands, hoping to destroy it and cement Japan's dominance in the Pacific. But this time, the Americans were ready. The key to their success wasn't firepower, it was intelligence. Weeks before the battle, cryptographers at Pearl Harbor broke the Japanese naval code JN-25. They discovered that the Japanese were planning to attack a target referred to as AF. To confirm their suspicion, the Americans sent out a false message saying Midway was short on fresh water. When they intercepted a Japanese transmission mentioning that AF was out of water, their suspicions were confirmed. The next Japanese target was indeed Midway. This crucial piece of intelligence gave Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the US Pacific Fleet, the upper hand in what would become one of the most decisive battles of the entire war. Admiral Chester Nimitz, a cautious yet daring strategist, decided not to wait for the Japanese attack. Instead, he set his own trap. He deployed the 3 American aircraft carriers that had survived Pearl Harbor to the waters near Midway, ready to ambush the massive Japanese fleet. The Battle of Midway, fought from June 4th to 7th, 1942, unfolded entirely in the skies. An aerial duel that would change the course of the war. American pilots, guided by decoded intelligence, located the Japanese fleet unprepared. In a swift and devastating strike, they sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers in a single day. That blow shattered the core of Japan's naval power. Not only did they lose ships and planes, but also their most skilled and seasoned pilots, losses that Japan could never replace. From that moment on, Japan's offensive momentum in the Pacific was gone. The empire that had once expanded relentlessly was now forced onto the defensive. Midway was far more than a victory. It was the turning point of the Pacific War, marking the beginning of a long and bloody island hopping campaign that would end only with Japan's surrender 3 years later. Meanwhile, in North Africa, the legendary German General Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, had been dominating the Desert War with his tactical brilliance. But his luck changed in mid-1942 with the arrival of his new British adversary, General Bernard Montgomery, a commander as methodical and disciplined as Rommel was daring and instinctive. By that time, Rommel's Afrika Korps had advanced deep into Egypt, coming within just 100 kilometers of the Suez Canal, a critical objective for controlling Middle Eastern oil. Yet, despite his progress, Rommel's position was precarious. His supply lines were overextended, his tanks worn down, and reinforcements were scarce. The British, under Montgomery's command, were in stark contrast, constantly resupplied and reinforced with new tanks and artillery. In October 1942, the Second Battle of El Alamein began. Unlike the fast-moving desert skirmishes that had characterized earlier battles, Montgomery's plan relied on sheer endurance and overwhelming firepower. Outnumbering Rommel's forces nearly 2-1, he launched relentless frontal assaults, supported by a massive artillery bombardment that roared for over 4 hours. Rommel's exhausted and outgunned troops tried to mount counterattacks with their remaining tanks, but the British were well prepared. They held firm and destroyed the German armour piece by piece. The battle dragged on for nearly 2 weeks, a grinding contest of attrition. In the end, with his army devastated and his supplies depleted, Rommel was forced to retreat, even as Hitler, in his usual stubbornness, ordered him to stand his ground. But Rommel, ignoring the Führer's order, continued his retreat, intent on saving what remained of his army. Montgomery's victory at El Alamein was decisive. Not only did he secure the Suez Canal and the vital access to Middle Eastern oil, but he also achieved the Allies' first great land triumph. Winston Churchill, with his characteristic eloquence, captured the battle's meaning. Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat. This success changed the momentum in Africa and lifted the morale of Allied forces and the British people who had endured the Blitz. At last, a glimmer of hope appeared. Yet, while Allies and Axis clashed for global control, another secret and perverse war was unfolding in the shadows. It was a war without battlefronts, driven by an ideology of hatred and annihilation, the Holocaust. Nazi doctrine, shaped by Hitler's writings, was more than political ambition or territorial greed. It was a racial creed that proclaimed the supposed superiority of the Aryan race and demanded the elimination of those deemed inferior or a threat to German purity. For the Nazis, the Jews were the principal enemy. They were cast as a conspiratorial race responsible for every misfortune, including Germany's defeat in the Great War. At first, persecution in Germany took the form of incremental measures, laws that discriminated, dispossessed, and stripped Jews of civil rights and property. But as the war expanded and the Reich occupied new territories, the regime's policies grew ever more extreme. The first mass killings, carried out by special units known as Einsatzgruppen, took place in Eastern Europe, where thousands of Jews were shot and buried in mass graves. Yet even these murders proved inefficient and psychologically draining for the executioners. The regime sought a more efficient mechanism. On January 20th, 1942, on the shore of a lake near Berlin, a clandestine meeting at a villa in the town of Wannsee sealed a new stage of horror. 15 high-ranking Nazi and SS officials met to coordinate what they called the final solution to the Jewish question. The meeting's chief organizer was SS leader Reinhard Heydrich. In roughly 90 minutes, they discussed the logistics of systematically annihilating Europe's Jewish population. The conference did not debate whether to kill the Jews, this was already decided, but how to carry out the extermination as quickly and efficiently as possible. The plan agreed upon called for the deportation of Europe's Jews, some 11 million by Nazi calculations, to concentration and extermination camps in the east. There, those deemed fit for labour would be worked to death. The rest, women, children, the elderly, would be murdered in gas chambers. The Wannsee Conference marked the bureaucratic culmination of Nazi industrialised murder. Mass murder ceased to be merely a war crime. It became a bureaucratic, industrial and calculated process designed for the total annihilation of an entire people. After the final solution was outlined at the Wannsee Conference, the Nazi extermination machine was set into motion. The first phase targeted the Jewish populations trapped in the ghettos. These ghettos were nothing more than walled urban prisons, built in the poorest and most overcrowded parts of occupied cities. The largest of them all, the Warsaw Ghetto, confined nearly 500,000 people in inhuman conditions. Life there was a daily struggle against hunger, disease, and despair. Food was scarce. The rations of bread and watery soup were never enough. Epidemics like typhus spread rapidly, claiming countless lives. Yet, even within those walls of misery, Jewish communities tried to preserve a semblance of dignity and normalcy. Secret schools were founded, underground newspapers circulated, and religious ceremonies continued, fragile acts of resistance amid barbarism. But the ghettos were only a temporary stage. The next phase was deportation. Systematically, the Nazis began emptying them. Deportations were often disguised as resettlements to work camps in the east. Families were herded into cattle cars, crammed together without food, water, or sanitation, enduring journeys that lasted for days. When the trains finally stopped, they did not find work, they found death. The destinations of these death trains were the extermination camps. The most infamous among them were Auschwitz-Birkenau and Treblinka. Auschwitz-Birkenau was not merely a death camp. It was a vast complex that combined extermination, forced labour, and imprisonment. It was engineered for efficiency, a factory of death where every step of the process had been planned with chilling precision. Upon arrival, prisoners faced selection. Those deemed fit for labour, usually young and strong men, were sent to work in nearby factories or within the camp itself, where starvation, disease, and exhaustion slowly consumed them. The others, the elderly, the sick, women, and children, were sent directly to the gas chambers. Treblinka, by contrast, existed for a single horrifying purpose: to kill. There were no barracks, no workshops, no prisoners, only the machinery of extermination. Upon arrival, victims were stripped of their possessions, told they were going to take showers, and led straight to the gas chambers. From the moment the trains arrived to the moment the killing was complete, only a few hours passed. It is estimated that over 850,000 people were murdered at Treblinka in just a little over a year. The Holocaust was not an explosion of uncontrolled violence. It was a systematic, ideological project of genocide, planned and executed with the cold precision of bureaucratic efficiency. The ghettos and extermination camps were the ultimate tools of this ideology of death, instruments designed not only to kill, but to erase the very essence of an entire people. In the shadows of the Nazi regime, the execution of the final solution fell into the hands of one of the most terrifying and merciless organizations in history, the SS, or Schutzstaffel, the protection squads. Under the command of Heinrich Himmler, the SS became far more than Hitler's elite guard. They evolved into the main engine of terror in the Third Reich, a vast empire of control that encompassed military divisions, police forces, and the entire network of concentration and extermination camps. Their creed was absolute loyalty to Hitler, racial purity, and unrestrained brutality. The SS designed the extermination camps, organised deportations, and directed the genocide with chilling bureaucratic precision. For them, mass murder was not chaos, it was duty. Every act of torture, every execution, every shipment of human lives toward death was carried out with methodical discipline. The guards who patrolled the camps were not rogue sadists, but functionaries of a system that had turned cruelty into routine. Yet, the genocide did not begin behind the barbed wire of the death camps. When the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, the first wave of mass killings was carried out by the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads composed of SS men, security police, and other collaborators. Their mission was simple and horrifying: follow the German army as it advanced eastward and wipe out undesirable populations, communists, Roma, and above all Jews. The Einsatzgruppen's methods were brutally direct. Victims were rounded up, forced to march to isolated ravines or open fields, stripped of their belongings, and shot. The corpses were thrown into mass graves, often dug by the victims themselves. This phase of the genocide, later known as the Holocaust by bullets, marked the beginning of systematic annihilation. Historians estimate that in less than 2 years, the Einsatzgruppen murdered more than 2 million people. The role of the SS and these death squads was pivotal. They were the living embodiment of an ideology that turned hatred into policy and obedience into slaughter. Unlike the regular Wehrmacht troops, who also committed atrocities, the SS and Einsatzgruppen existed for one purpose: extermination. Their crimes stand as one of humanity's darkest reminders of how ideology, when fused with power and dehumanization, can corrupt entire institutions and erase all traces of compassion. Meanwhile, as Europe burned under Nazi control, the tide of war began to shift. After the decisive Allied victory in North Africa, the question arose: where would the Allies strike next to break Hitler's fortress? The answer came swiftly. On July 9, 1943, they launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, the great island to the south of Italy. Nearly 500,000 soldiers, over 4,000 ships, and hundreds of aircraft took part in what became the largest amphibious assault in history up to that point. The operation was a success, and it marked the beginning of the end for Mussolini's fascist regime. Despite the fierce initial resistance of Italian and German troops, the Allied forces, led by General George Patton in the west and General Bernard Montgomery in the east, managed to conquer Sicily in just over a month. The fall of the island triggered a political earthquake in Italy. The defeat, coupled with growing public discontent, led to a coup in Rome. On July 25, 1943, the Great Fascist Council, with the support of King Victor Emmanuel III, voted to depose Benito Mussolini. The Duce, who had ruled Italy with an iron hand for more than 2 decades, was arrested. For the Allies, it was not only a strategic success, but also a powerful moral victory. With Mussolini out of power, the new Italian government under Marshal Pietro Badoglio secretly opened negotiations with the Allies. The armistice was announced on September 8, 1943. But what was expected to be the end of war for Italy turned into chaos. The Germans, anticipating betrayal, reacted immediately and with overwhelming force. They disarmed Italian units, occupied the country, and transformed it into a battlefield. Hitler refused to accept the fall of his fascist ally. He ordered Operation Oak, a daring rescue mission that would become legendary. A special SS commando unit led by Otto Skorteny flew in gliders to the remote mountain hotel where Mussolini was being held prisoner. In a stunning feat of precision, they rescued him without firing a single shot. Mussolini was taken to Germany and reinstated as the head of a puppet regime, the so-called Italian Social Republic, based in northern Italy. But his authority was purely symbolic. The real power lay entirely in Hitler's hands. Meanwhile, the German army braced itself for the Allied invasion. The man tasked with halting their advance was Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, one of Germany's most skilled defensive commanders. The Allies believed that Italy's surrender would open an easy road to Rome. They were wrong. Kesselring exploited the mountainous geography of the peninsula to his advantage, fortifying it with a series of defensive lines, the most formidable of which was the Gustav Line, stretching across central Italy. The campaign soon turned into a slow, grinding war of attrition. Every hill, every river crossing, every small town became a battlefield. The advance north was paid for in blood, metre by metre. Mussolini's fall and Italy's defection were vital victories for the Allies, but the fierce German resistance under Kesselring proved that the war in Europe was far from over. The fighting would drag on, claiming countless lives before the end. And as the Eastern Front continued to devour Hitler's armies, the Western Allies prepared for their most ambitious operation yet, the opening of a second front in Europe. The selected location was northern France. The mission would be named Operation Overlord, but the day of the attack would be remembered in history simply as D-Day. On June 6, 1944, under overcast skies and rain, the largest amphibious operation ever attempted commenced. The goal was to land on the beaches of Normandy along the French coastline, a spot Hitler regarded as the Atlantic Wall, an impregnable stronghold. The invasion involved 156,000 troops, 10,000 aircraft, and nearly 7,000 naval vessels. The strategy was for American, British, and Canadian forces to storm 5 beaches with significant names: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Secrecy was essential. The Germans anticipated the attack at Calais, the closest point to Great Britain. the Allies misled Hitler through an elaborate deception plan called Operation Fortitude, which used inflatable tanks and fake radio messages to convince him the landing would occur at Calais. Each beach told a different story. The Americans fared relatively well at Utah Beach. German defences had been weakened by the misinformation and precise naval bombardments, allowing the troops to advance swiftly inland and link up with paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines. Omaha, however, was a nightmare. The high tide concealed the German fortifications, and Allied bombers had failed to destroy the bunkers. American soldiers were met with relentless machine gun and artillery fire, a slaughter that turned the landing into a fight for survival lasting hours. Omaha was where the Allies came closest to failure, and only the determination and bravery of the troops allowed them to break through and progress. Gold, Juno and Sword saw better outcomes. British and Canadian forces, despite stiff German resistance, managed to secure their beachheads and push inland. D-Day was not an instant triumph. The push through Normandy would be slow and brutal, but the landing itself was a historic success. The Allies had accomplished the unthinkable, establishing a foothold in Nazi-occupied Europe and opening the long-awaited Second Front. Hitler's grip on Germany was tightening, and although his downfall was not yet certain, it had become unavoidable. The Allied commanders played a decisive part in the triumph of D-Day and the subsequent liberation of Europe. Each brought a distinct personality and leadership style, and together they formed an extraordinary alliance. At the top stood American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe. Though not known for tactical brilliance on the battlefield, Eisenhower's true talent lay in strategy and leadership. He was a diplomat and organizer above all, able to unite an assembly of powerful egos, from British and French leaders to his own fellow Americans. Eisenhower was the mind that coordinated land, sea and air operations in the most complex military endeavour of the war. His calm temperament, pragmatic approach, and ability to preserve harmony within a fragile coalition were fundamental to D-Day's success, and ultimately to Germany's defeat. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was the complete opposite of Patton. Renowned for his meticulous nature, caution, and obsession with preparation, Montgomery commanded all Allied ground forces during the Normandy invasion. His approach was methodical. He refused to act unless he held clear and overwhelming superiority. In Normandy, he orchestrated a series of heavy assaults that kept the German panzer divisions tied down on the British front, giving Patton's American forces the freedom to push westward. Montgomery's arrogance often clashed with his peers, but his precision and determination were vital during the initial stages of the Northern France campaign. General George S. Patton, on the other hand, embodied the spirit of bold, relentless armoured warfare. Charismatic, flamboyant, and unapologetically outspoken, Patton commanded the US Third Army. After the Normandy battle reached a stalemate, Patton unleashed a lightning offensive that broke through German lines and raced across northern France at astonishing speed, so fast that his tanks frequently ran out of fuel. His daring nature came with friction. He often quarrelled with Eisenhower and Montgomery. Yet his ferocity and drive proved indispensable to the Allied advance. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the tide had long since turned. After the monumental Soviet victory at Stalingrad, the Red Army seized the initiative. Through 1943 and early 1944, German forces were pushed back relentlessly, losing ground they had conquered at the war's outset. Then came the decisive summer offensive of 1944, Operation Barbarossa. Launched on June 22nd, it was a massive coordinated strike against the German Army Group Centre in occupied Belarus. Unlike earlier frontal assaults, this was a masterpiece of Soviet strategy, swift, calculated, and devastating. The Soviet armies launched a massive assault along a 700-kilometer front, employing a pincer tactic designed to encircle and annihilate the German divisions. The offensive was a stunning success. Within days, the German defences collapsed under the overwhelming force of the Red Army. The Soviet advance moved with extraordinary speed. In just a few weeks, the German Army Group Centre was nearly wiped out. Over 500,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in one of the most catastrophic defeats suffered by Germany during the entire war. With the front shattered, the Red Army began its unstoppable march toward Berlin. Their advance was relentless, driven not only by strategy, but also by vengeance. After enduring years of brutal occupation, Soviet troops pressed forward with fierce determination, liberating town after town as they pushed deeper into Nazi territory. Every kilometre gained freed thousands from suffering and brought the Soviets closer to the heart of the Third Reich. Along their path, they liberated concentration and extermination camps, exposing to the world the full horror of Nazi atrocities. The advance of Operation Barbarossa and the subsequent Soviet offensive was more than a military triumph. It marked the beginning of the end of the nightmare in the East. Though the war in Europe would rage for nearly another year, the Soviet surge made Germany's defeat inevitable. With the Western Allies driving through France and the Red Army closing in from the east, the walls around Hitler's empire were tightening. By the end of 1944, Nazi Germany's situation had become desperate. The Red Army advanced relentlessly from one side, while the Western Allies neared the German border from the other. Yet Hitler refused to accept defeat. In a final act of delusion and defiance, he conceived a bold plan to reverse his fading fortunes, a massive surprise attack on the Western Front intended to split the Allied forces and compel them to negotiate peace. The assault would strike through the dense forests of the Ardennes, the same region that had brought him victory in France in 1940. On December the 16th, 1944, under heavy fog and snow that grounded Allied aircraft, Hitler launched his offensive. Over 250,000 German troops and thousands of tanks surged forward, catching the Americans completely off guard. The armoured divisions pushed deep into enemy territory, forming a bulge in the Allied lines, a feature that gave the battle its name, the Battle of the Bulge, or the Battle of the Ardennes. At first, the offensive achieved remarkable success. The unprepared American divisions were overwhelmed, and the German advance spread panic and confusion behind Allied lines. But the momentum soon began to falter. Despite their early gains, German forces met fierce resistance at key positions. One of the most notable stands occurred in the small Belgian town of Bastogne, a symbol of Allied courage and endurance. The American troops, though completely surrounded, refused to surrender. Their resilience slowed the German advance and changed the course of the battle. As the fighting dragged on, Germany's position became unsustainable. The element of surprise had vanished, and the Allies began to regroup their strength. When the fog and bad weather finally lifted, Allied air power returned to the skies. Fighters and bombers decimated German convoys, while the panzer divisions ran desperately low on fuel and supplies. The once powerful German offensive, which had begun with such ferocity, sank into the mud and snow of the Ardennes. By the end of January 1945, the Germans were forced to withdraw, abandoning thousands of destroyed tanks, vehicles and artillery pieces. The Battle of the Ardennes was more than a defeat. It was the final blow that sealed the fate of the Axis. The Wehrmacht had exhausted its last reserves of men and equipment, losses it could no longer replace. The Western Front stabilised once again, but this time there was nothing left to stop the Allied advance toward the heart of Germany. Hitler's final hope had vanished. His empire was collapsing, and its end was only a matter of time. The year 1945 marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Following the failed Ardennes offensive, the unstoppable Soviet Red Army continued its push from the east. With the Western Allies crossing the Rhine River and the Soviets nearing Berlin, the encirclement of the German capital was complete. On April 16, 1945, the Soviets launched their final assault on the city. Under the command of Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev, the Soviet forces vastly outnumbered the remaining German defenders. The battle for Berlin was a descent into chaos, a hellish confrontation fought amid the ruins. The city became a wasteland, and combat raged house by house, street by street, in one of the most brutal urban battles of the entire war. Meanwhile, deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler remained in his bunker, detached from reality. He issued impossible orders to armies that no longer existed, and lashed out at his generals for their failures. As Soviet troops closed in, his paranoia deepened. Realizing the end was near, he chose not to flee. On April 30th, 1945, with the Red Army only meters away, Hitler married his longtime companion, Eva Braun, in a brief ceremony. Hours later, he shot himself in the head, while Braun took cyanide. Their bodies were burned by aides on his orders to prevent them from falling into Soviet hands. Hitler's death marked the final collapse of the Nazi regime. A week later, on May 7, 1945, German military leaders signed an unconditional surrender in Reims, France. The following day, May 8th, the act was ratified in Berlin. In Europe, the war had finally come to an end. Hitler's death and the fall of Berlin mark the closing chapter of a war that had ravaged an entire continent and claimed the lives of tens of millions. With the Führer gone and the German capital in ruins, the remaining High Command had no choice but to confront reality. The Western Allies advanced from one side, the Red Army from the other. There was nowhere left to turn. Surrender was no longer a decision to consider, but the only possible outcome. On May 7, 1945, General Alfred Jodl, representing the German High Command, signed the unconditional surrender of all German armed forces at General Dwight D. Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, France. The document declared that all hostilities in Europe would cease at 11:01 p.m. on May 8, 1945. Yet for Stalin, the Reims ceremony was insufficient. He viewed it as merely symbolic, lacking the weight of a surrender carried out in the heart of Nazi Germany itself. Therefore, he demanded a second signing. On May 8th, in a formal ceremony held in Berlin, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed the final and definitive instrument of surrender. That act officially ended the war in Europe. The following day, May 9th, the Soviet Union proclaimed the end of the Great Patriotic War, a date still celebrated across Russia and many former Soviet republics. The signing of the surrender marked the conclusion of a conflict that had shattered Europe beyond recognition. Nazism, once boasting dreams of a 1,000-year empire, had crumbled in barely 12. The world that had existed before the war was gone forever. Ahead lay a long and difficult path toward peace and reconstruction, but at last the nightmare in Europe was over. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the struggle raged on. After the turning point at Midway, the war there had evolved into a brutal, drawn-out campaign, fought island by island, as the Allies, led by the United States, slowly advanced toward Japan. But as the conflict neared its end, the fighting grew ever more desperate. Japanese troops defended their homeland with a ferocity bordering on fanaticism. The battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa became grim symbols of the Pacific War's savagery. Both islands held immense strategic importance. Iwo Jima, a small volcanic speck in the ocean, offered airfields essential for American bombers striking Japan, places to land when damaged or low on fuel. Okinawa, meanwhile, would serve as the staging ground for the planned invasion of Japan's main islands. The Battle of Iwo Jima, launched in February 1945, was nothing short of infernal. The Japanese, fully aware that victory was impossible, prepared to die rather than surrender. Instead of building fortifications on the beaches, they created an intricate maze of tunnels and underground bunkers. When the American Marines landed, an eerie silence greeted them until, suddenly, Japanese machine guns and artillery erupted, unleashing hell. Top of form, bottom of form. The Marines had to wrestle for every inch of the volcanic terrain. The fight dragged on for 5 weeks and became one of the bloodiest engagements in the history of the US Marine Corps. The Battle of Okinawa, which began in April 1945, was even larger and far more savage. Some 280,000 Japanese troops confronted upwards of 500,000 Allied soldiers and sailors. The Japanese employed deeply layered defensive tactics, and the campaign lasted nearly 3 months. Okinawa, the last great land battle of the war, turned into a slaughter men fought in mud and caves, while Japanese kamikaze pilots hurled themselves at Allied ships. Casualties at Iwo Jima and Okinawa were enormous on both sides. On Iwo Jima, more than 26,000 Americans were killed or wounded, and of the roughly 20,000 Japanese defenders, only a little over 200 were captured alive. On Okinawa, the Allies suffered in excess of 65,000 casualties, while Japanese military losses exceeded 100,000, and a vast number of civilians were also killed, forced into combat, or driven to suicide. The staggering human toll on those small islands created profound dread about a full-scale invasion of Japan. American planners estimated that Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan's home islands, could cost the Allies 1 million casualties and produce even greater Japanese losses. The Japanese population, steeped in a code of death and honour, seemed ready to resist to the last person. Iwo Jima and Okinawa made clear that defeating Japan by conventional invasion would exact an incalculable human price. That grim reality became the decisive factor for President Harry S. Truman. Faced with the fearsome cost of invasion, attention turned to a secret program that had been underway for years, the Manhattan Project, the effort to build a weapon of unprecedented destructive power, the atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project was a vast scientific and industrial undertaking that assembled the world's leading physicists, engineers, and mathematicians in a race against time. Its origins trace back to a 1939 letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt from Albert Einstein, warning that Nazi Germany might be pursuing atomic weapons. Though Einstein did not take part in building the bomb, his warning helped spark the program. At the project's center was the clandestine laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico, led by the brilliant and magnetic theoretical physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer served as the scientific director, assembling an international team to solve the immense technical challenges required to harness nuclear fission and unleash an almost unimaginable release of energy. The Manhattan Project consumed billions of dollars and, at its peak, employed more than 130,000 people. Yet it was cloaked in such secrecy that even Vice President Harry S. Truman remained unaware of its existence until he assumed the presidency following Franklin D. Roosevelt's death in April 1945. On July 16, 1945, the project reached its climax with the first detonation of an atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert, a test code named Trinity. The explosion was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The great mushroom cloud that rose into the sky confirmed that humankind had entered a new, perilous era. From that moment, President Truman faced a decision of historic magnitude to authorize a bloody invasion of Japan that could cost more than 1 million lives, or to use the most destructive weapon ever devised by man. It was a choice between two horrors, calculated in lives saved versus lives lost, and made with the desperate aim of ending the war once and for all. Ironically, the bomb that had originally been conceived to prevent a Nazi victory would now be used to force Japan's surrender and close the final chapter of World War II, convinced that its use would ultimately save countless lives and bring a swift end to the fighting. Truman made his choice. On August 6, 1945, under a bright and cloudless morning sky, an American B-29 bomber named Enola Gay flew over Hiroshima, a major military and industrial center. At precisely 8:15 a.m., the uranium bomb known as Little Boy was released. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. A blinding flash lit the sky, followed by a massive shockwave that obliterated nearly everything within a 1-kilometer radius. A towering atomic cloud climbed into the heavens as the city below was reduced to ash. In seconds, most of Hiroshima vanished. Between 60,000 and 80,000 people died instantly. Thousands more were burned beyond recognition, or succumbed in the days that followed to the invisible agony of radiation sickness. What came next was a black, oily rain radioactive fallout descending upon the survivors, sealing their fate. And yet, even after the devastation of Hiroshima, Japan's government refused to surrender. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, another B-29 bomber, Bockscar, took off carrying a second atomic bomb, this time bound for a new target. The primary target of the second atomic mission was the city of Kokura, but poor visibility caused the crew to divert toward the secondary target, Nagasaki, a major port and industrial hub. The bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, was even more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. Its detonation was catastrophic. Although the hills surrounding Nagasaki limited the blast radius, the devastation was still overwhelming. More than 74,000 people died instantly or in the following days, while thousands more suffered from burns and radiation poisoning that would haunt future generations. The combined destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, along with the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan, finally broke the last vestiges of Japanese resistance. Emperor Hirohito, realizing that continued fighting meant total annihilation, made the historic decision to intervene personally and demand his government's unconditional surrender. President Truman's choice had ended the war, but at an immeasurable moral and human cost. The dawn of the atomic age was both a triumph of science and a chilling warning of humanity's potential for self-destruction. Despite an attempted coup by extremist officers who sought to prevent surrender, Emperor Hirohito took an unprecedented step. On August 15, 1945, he addressed the nation directly in a radio broadcast known as the Dual Voice Broadcast. For the first time in history, the Japanese people heard their emperor's voice. In his solemn speech, Hirohito never uttered the word defeat. Instead, he declared that the war had not necessarily developed to Japan's advantage, and spoke of a new and most cruel bomb, whose power threatened the very survival of civilization. He urged his people to accept peace, thus bringing the war to an end. The formal signing of Japan's surrender took place on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the American battleship USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. Japan was represented by Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and General Yoshijiro Umezu, while General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, signed on behalf of the Allies. With that act, the Second World War officially ended. After nearly 6 years of global conflict, the deadliest and most destructive in human history, Japan's defeat ushered in a new era. The world emerged divided between two superpowers and overshadowed by the terrifying reality of nuclear weapons. The Axis powers had fallen. The world lay in ruins. And now the victors faced an immense task: to rebuild civilization and design a fragile new order out of the ashes. The old world, ruled for centuries by Europe's colonial empires, was gone forever. A new and uncertain age had begun. In the aftermath of the Second World War, two colossal powers emerged from the ruins, ideological opposites destined to dominate global politics for the next half-century. The first step towards shaping this new world took place at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, while the war in Europe was still raging. The Big Three, Franklin D. Roosevelt, President of the United States, Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, met to decide the fate of post-war Germany and Eastern Europe. At Yalta, it was agreed that Germany would be divided into 4 occupation zones, each controlled by one of the Allied powers: the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Stalin also pledged that the USSR would join the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender, and, most importantly, that free elections would be held in the Eastern European nations liberated by the Red Army. However, by the time of the Potsdam Conference in the summer of 1945, the balance of power had shifted dramatically. Roosevelt was dead, replaced by Harry S. Truman, and Churchill, defeated in the British elections midway through the meeting, was succeeded by Clement Attlee. The fragile alliance that had defeated Hitler began to fracture. Though the Allied leaders reaffirmed Germany's division and the goals of demilitarization, denazification, and democratization, deep mistrust began to surface. Stalin's promise of free elections soon dissolved as the Soviet Union tightened its grip on Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, during the very conference, Truman received word of the successful atomic bomb test in New Mexico, a revelation that transformed his posture. The newfound weapon gave the United States an immense sense of power and confidence, but it also sparked fear and paranoia in Stalin, who immediately accelerated the Soviet nuclear program. The war had shattered the old European powers. Great Britain and France, though technically victorious, were economically exhausted, and their colonial empires were crumbling. Into this vacuum stepped two nations not only unscathed by the war, but stronger than ever before. The United States emerged as the world's first undisputed superpower. Its homeland had been untouched by conflict, and its vast wartime industry, once dedicated to producing endless weapons and supplies, now fueled an unparalleled economic boom. America possessed the largest economy on Earth and the sole atomic arsenal, presenting itself as the champion of liberal democracy and capitalism, a symbol of freedom and prosperity. On the opposite side stood the Soviet Union, the second great superpower. Despite suffering catastrophic destruction and millions of casualties, It commanded the largest army in the world and held control over half of Europe. Under Stalin, communism was promoted as an ideological alternative to capitalism. Determined to secure Soviet dominance, he established pro-Soviet regimes throughout Eastern Europe, creating the Iron Curtain, a political and ideological divide that would split the continent for decades to come. The Yalta and Potsdam conferences, designed to secure peace, laid the groundwork for an entirely new type of conflict. The Cold War would not be fought with tanks and planes, but through ideologies, propaganda, and a nuclear arms race. The Allies, who had once fought side by side against Hitler, now regarded each other with suspicion. The world, split between the capitalist bloc and the communist bloc, stood on the edge of a nuclear abyss. World War II had ended, yet peace did not signal the close of history, but the start of a new and perilous confrontation. At the war's conclusion, the globe faced an unprecedented challenge. How could the leaders of a regime responsible for unimaginable crimes be held accountable? The solution came through the Nuremberg trials, a judicial process that aimed not only to punish the guilty, but also to establish a new international standard of justice. The trials were held in the German city that had served as the heart of Nazi Party demonstrations. There, the International Military Tribunal, composed of judges and prosecutors from the United States, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and France, convened to try the main Nazi leaders. The goal was clear: to demonstrate that no one, regardless of rank, was above the law. The defendants faced charges never before applied in a trial of this scale. The tribunal issued 4 principal accusations: crimes against peace, involving the initiation and planning of a war of aggression, war crimes including the murder of prisoners of war and civilians, forced labour and destruction of property without military necessity, crimes against humanity, encompassing genocide and the systematic persecution of civilian populations, such as Jews for racial or religious reasons, and conspiracy, the planning of the previous crimes. The defence argued that they were merely following orders, but the tribunal rejected this, declaring that obedience to superiors does not absolve one of responsibility for their actions. Although the trials have been criticised as victors' justice, their impact on international law is undeniable. The Nuremberg trials set a historic precedent. For the first time, individuals, not just states, were held criminally responsible for international crimes. Furthermore, concepts such as crimes against humanity became the foundation for modern international criminal law. Nuremberg's legacy was not merely punitive, it was also a warning to the future. It showed that the international community could unite to hold perpetrators of atrocities accountable, and that impunity would have no place in the world. Today, the International Criminal Court and other international tribunals are direct heirs of the principles established at Nuremberg, striving to bring those who commit heinous crimes to justice anywhere in the world. The trials marked the end of the war and the beginning of a new chapter for humanity, one aiming to build a more just and responsible world. In the aftermath of World War II, the world recognised the need for a global organisation capable of mediating conflicts and preventing another total war. The League of Nations, which had failed in its mission, was replaced by a stronger and more capable organisation, the United Nations. The concept of the United Nations emerged from discussions among the Allied leaders. The UN Charter was drafted by representatives from 50 countries at the San Francisco Conference, held between April and June 1945. The Charter was signed on June 26th and came into effect on October 24th of that year. Its primary purpose, expressed in the preamble, was to save future generations from the scourge of war and reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights. Unlike the League of Nations, the United Nations was designed with the authority to take decisive action. Its framework was built around several key bodies: the General Assembly, where every member nation has a voice and a vote, serving as a forum for global discussion, and the Security Council, the most powerful body tasked with maintaining peace and international security. The Council was granted the authority to impose economic sanctions and, in extreme cases, authorize military intervention. It is composed of 15 members, 5 of whom hold permanent seats. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, and the Soviet Union, now Russia, hold veto power, a mechanism that has been both debated and criticised over the years. The UN also includes the International Court of Justice to resolve disputes between nations, along with specialised agencies such as the World Health Organization, WHO, and UNESCO. Over time, the United Nations has helped prevent numerous conflicts and has played a key role in promoting human rights, humanitarian assistance, and economic development. While it has faced criticism for inefficiency and power struggles among member states, it remains the primary forum for diplomatic dialogue and international arbitration. The creation of the UN marked the final act of World War II, a concerted effort by nations to learn from past mistakes and build a more peaceful world, an effort that continues today. After the Allies' victory over the Axis, the sense of a united front among the victors quickly dissolved. The ideological rift between the two emerging superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, became irreconcilable, and the world was divided in two. This new form of confrontation, absent direct military clashes between the superpowers, would be known as the Cold War. Tensions became public in March 1946, when former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered a speech in Fulton, Missouri, with American President Harry S. Truman standing beside him. In his famous address, Churchill warned that from Stettin on the Baltic to Trieste on the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent. This phrase, instantly iconic, came to symbolize Europe's ideological and physical division. At first, the Iron Curtain was metaphorical, representing the stark separation between East and West. In the West, capitalist democracies came under the influence of the United States. In the East, the nations of Eastern Europe, liberated by the Red Army, fell firmly under Soviet control. These countries, governed by Moscow-backed puppet regimes, became the Eastern Bloc, also known as the Communist Bloc. Over time, the Iron Curtain took on a more tangible form, with walls, fences, and heavily guarded border zones designed to prevent the population from fleeing to the west. The most iconic symbol of this division would be the Berlin Wall, a concrete barrier that epitomized the Cold War. The Cold War's formal beginning is often marked by 1947, with the announcement of the Truman Doctrine, a policy aimed at containing the spread of communism. In his address to Congress, President Truman pledged both economic and military support to nations threatened by Soviet expansion, including Greece and Turkey. Complementing this initiative, the Marshall Plan was introduced, a massive program of economic aid to rebuild Western Europe. Its dual purpose was to prevent poverty-stricken nations from falling under communist influence, while simultaneously creating new markets for American goods. The Soviet Union responded by tightening its grip on the Eastern Bloc and establishing military and economic alliances in opposition to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The Cold War quickly evolved into an arms race, with the United States and the Soviet Union vying to amass the most powerful nuclear arsenals. Although the two superpowers never engaged directly in combat, their allies fought proxy wars across the globe in regions such as Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan. The end of the Second World War did not deliver the lasting peace humanity had hoped for, but rather the onset of a tense confrontation that would shape the following decades. Thus, the story of the Second World War, the most immense and destructive conflict in human history, comes to a close. From the rise of tyrants and the horrors of Blitzkrieg to the heroism of battles like Stalingrad and Midway, from the nightmare of extermination camps to the shadow cast by the atomic bomb, the war left a legacy of devastation. Yet it also offers vital lessons about the fragility of peace, the resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring struggle between light and darkness. It is a story we cannot and must not forget. If this journey through the history of the Second World War has captivated you, consider joining our community. Subscribe to stay updated on the next historical stories. Share in the comments which part of the war affected you most, and what other historical events you would like us to explore. And if you enjoyed this narrative, leave a like to help this story reach more people. Thank you for being part of this journey. This is Sleepy History. See you in the next chapter of the story.